Welcome to the Coaching Family Soccer Coaching Podcast, a podcast for soccer coaches from grassroots to the pro game. Soccer coaches who love the game, love coaching, and want to get better. Join our community on Twitter @CoachingFamily.
So guys, welcome back to another Coaching Family Soccer Coaching Podcast, the coach for soccer coaches all around the world at all levels. And today we're talking about communication. So another interesting theme. And as always, my trusted colleague here, Glenn Hicks, joins us. How you doing, Glenn?
Good, thanks, mate. Doing very, very well. Looking forward to this one. Could go anywhere, this one.
Exactly. That's what I often do. And listen, like I say, if you've got any ideas for shows or ideas for guests, please let us know. And thanks again for all the feedback on socials we're getting. And if you are enjoying the show, please do leave a review. It really does help out. But thanks very much. And let's crack on then. So go on then, Mr. Hicks. What do you reckon about this one, communication?
The starting point would be, Saul, I think if we had to pick the top three most important tools for a coach, it's definitely in the top three. And I'm not, like, the longer I've been coaching, the more I believe that as well. So the importance of our communication as coaches during sessions, before, after, and our interactions with all of the people we work with, from our employers to the young people we're trying to teach the game of football, to the parents of those people. It is no doubt the top 2 or 3 skills that we need to be developing consciously as coaches, including languages, speaking different languages. So yeah, that would be the starting point to say, coaches, if you're not working on it, you should be, and you should be spending a hell of a lot of your time really consciously and mindfully working at your communication. So that would be the starting point for me.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you think, if I think back to my coaching courses, I can't really remember that much in terms of, communication. I mean, I remember this stuff I did in the advanced youth around that, but I mean, generally, practically, it's more about, how you're delivering. I suppose, if you're talking about stop, stand still, or how you doing your interventions. But I mean, I remember Tim Bradbury, who's obviously I talk about a lot, one of my important mentors in my career, talking about the importance of delivery and communication and personality. Obviously, particularly with the youngest age groups, having that, let's use the word again, personality to deliver and be enigmatic and really create like a captive audience is so important. And I was actually talking to one of the partner clubs the other day, one of my personal football coach club partners the other day, and they were talking about session design and stuff. And he said, he watches a lot of the sessions. He asked me how. He goes, he actually noticed in my sessions when he watches them on the coaches pass, how do I manage to seem to keep the players so engaged? And I think that's so much part of it is your personality, in terms of, I always say in my sessions, I want them coming out after an hour or whatever, or 2 hours, going, wow, what an experience that was, and that's really about, tempo and intensity and the way you deliver, and, obviously about, how you tweak your sessions, but so much is about how you're, engaging the players and keeping them, captivated and, on tender hooks almost, trying to, I think it's such an important thing. And so much of that really is comes down to a lot about coaches, again, personality, or maybe like their natural ability to do that.
Yeah, definitely. And the individual personality thing is important for us coaches as well, Saul, because some people are quite garrulous and chatty, and I've been told I talk far too much sometimes, and quite often, actually. Quite often. And, I used to be a bit insecure about that, Saul, but I'm not, because I think as we're getting older, I think we're probably a bit more selective with our words. I probably used to waffle a lot more than I do now. I hope so anyway. And I hope that in 20 years' time, I'm probably a bit more concise with my own words. But you come across coaches as well, and we come across players that, I've got a couple of young people I'm working with at the moment, so where you've almost got mutism. They're almost like they don't say anything. Their football does their talking for them, but they don't say much. And when you come across young people like that are probably a bit more introverted, and they don't say much, to even just engage and have a conversation takes a hell of a lot of skill of knowing what to say, how to say it, because what you don't want to do as well is you don't want to force people to talk. There's nothing worse than being told, go on stage and present in front of people, and you don't really want to do that if that's not your nature. So we've got to be, I think when it comes to communication, we've got to really be sensitive to individualize it and have have real manageable expectations for each individual, because some children do love to talk. Like I said, they're naturally extrovert and they will dominate a lot of the conversation. And sometimes you will have to say, okay, Sam, can we let little Jenna over there or Joey have a word in here as well? Or you have to provoke that out of people. Okay, so what's your opinion? And there's a lot of thought. The more you look at it, there's a lot of thought and skill that goes into it. So in terms of, because at the end of the day, communication is about relationships, isn't it? And, you know, whether we're trying to build a relationship with our players, or like I say, with our parents, or even at home with the wife, you know, we've all been there where we've said things, oh, probably shouldn't have said that. I'm in the doghouse, or vice versa. And, you know, when there's emotions attached, when you've got children that love the game of football and want to be at your session, or, you know, hopefully, you know, we love our wives, they love us. And, you know, sometimes we say the wrong things at the wrong time. So I just think, it's just a massive part of everything that we do in coaching, if we're talking about building relationships.
Yeah, because us, you know, you got the coaching communication, and you got the communication between the players. I mean, you mentioned an interesting thing there about, you know, being uncomfortable in public speaking. I used to have a massive phobia about public speaking. I could deliver a session and didn't really care and do that, but if I had to get up in front of a group of, you know, peers or anyone else, and parents, or, you know, on courses, I just get really, you know, panicking, even as a, you know, as a former teacher, and I have a real phobia. And then I sort of had to say to myself, look, if you want to be, you know, at the top of your game, or, you know, a leader in this field, you've got to get over this phobia. And my thing was, like, I challenged myself to do it and take every opportunity to communicate, you know, get up in class. And then every time, you know, I was asked to speak or go to a convention, or in a group setting, or on a course, I'd actually say, right, I want to do it, because put myself in that situation for the experience. I hated it. And then I just become more and more accustomed to it, and more, you know, like anything, the more experience you have doing it, the more you become, you know, relaxed and doing it. And I speak, a lot of people that say the same, oh, I hate public speaking. I say, look, you know, I used to, and people say, what, you? And, like, you know, I go and do conferences now and talk in front of 100 or 200 people, or do sessions and stuff like that. It's just like anything, it's practice, isn't it? I was not a natural orator. You know, I'm not naturally, I used to hate it, but then you just say, right, just do it. You get enough experience, you just do it, you do it. Anyway, so excuse me, what I'm trying to get around to saying is that it's just interesting that you challenge yourself. And I think that about players as well, almost, isn't it? So, you know, I remember my first experiences at Tottenham in the academy, going to see those sessions and going, wow. One of my biggest takeaways was obviously not just about the intensity of the session, was just how much the players spoke and, you know, talk to each other, say, yeah, come on, well done, good effort. You know, just the general, you know, chat amongst the players in terms of motivating each other, supporting each other, challenging each other. And I was like, wow. And you could obviously tell that was you know, an intentional outcome which we tried to get. And you see that in most academy environments. So that's what you're talking about, those players. That how do we challenge them? You know, is when I'm working with coaches as well, you challenge them, say, you got to do it, you got to come out of your comfort zone. So for example, again, I'm here in Thailand, you know, I'm working with Thai players a lot, lucky to work with some top players in the MDEN team. And, you know, don't speak a word of English, but they don't talk either. Very much culturally, I think here, you know, there's not a lot of chat. A few players do. So trying to support the players to talk. And I said to him, said to him last night, so look, you know, you want to play top level football, you've got to learn how to talk to each other. You know, you got to learn how to do it, and, you know, communicate even simple things like, set here, this is where I want it. You know, you watch a training session to be one of the quietest sessions you've ever seen. So I think it's really important to think about how do we, you know, develop ourselves to communicate with, and also think about, right, our players, how do we develop those guys to be talkers as well, and try and develop those, you know, leadership qualities, if you like, or just, you know, qualities of people who've been able to, you know, impose yourself in any situation. Yeah,
so I think a few things there. The whole experience thing, so as well, I think coaches I've got to understand as well. So I'm very similar to you. So I'm not naturally comfortable in talking in front of big audiences. And when people see me talk to parents, you know, recruitment days and whatever else, I'm pretty comfortable with it now, but I've been doing it a long time and well practiced. But as a young child, you know, I used to hang on my mum's leg, and I was quite shy in social situations, and probably am still quite socially awkward, to be honest with you. I'm not a natural extrovert. So coaches have got to understand as well, it's not so much if you have a certain personality. I think it's still a skill that can be developed, and how you do that is up to you. Do you know what I mean? If you are front and center stage. But one thing I would say so about, because there's different things we've got to be communicating, isn't there? You know, we've got to try and communicate our game to the players. So the stuff you said about Spurs a minute ago, Saul, you know, one thing that I think is tremendous when you start producing players is there's In terms of communication, there's a consistency with football terminology when you're at a place like Spurs. And if you go to Chelsea, you'll hear a lot of the same words being said, and hopefully there's a consistency of the philosophy coming out. So, and that's about getting the technical and the tactical football idea across. One of the big things with communication, so which all coaches would have experienced, I think, is, and I think it comes down to experience and just doing it, is when you're challenging behaviour and when you're trying to develop group behavior and a consistent way of behaving amongst all coaches and amongst all players. So anyone that's running a grassroots club, not just a team, to be able to get all of your coaches to behave in the correct manner or the same way or a similar way on a Sunday, for example, is very difficult. You know, we just had a seven-a-side festival the other day, and we deliberately put some little technical areas out. So, and you know, I thought I was very clear in saying, okay, guys, you know, I know it's going to be a competitive tournament. Can you try and stay in the technical areas? And before you know it, 3 or 4 games in, the coach is playing right and left wing again for their team, and, you know, getting a bit carried away with ourselves. So the messages that we're giving out in terms of behaviour, I think, are some of the hardest things to communicate at times, because sometimes people don't want to get confrontational and they don't want to challenge, or sometimes don't know how to challenge poor behaviour or challenging behaviour. Do you know what I mean? So there's different forms of communication.
Because you talk a couple of things there, you're really talking about culture, aren't you? You know, trying to create a culture amongst the players, amongst the coaches. You know, this is the culture, this is our methodology, this is the philosophy, as you say. You know, I remember us going back to Spurs again, and Richard Allen talked about, you know, and we and Chris talked about as well, Chris Ramsey, you know, when they first went into Spurs, it was such a culture shock for all the coaches, what they were doing, such an unconventional way of coaching in terms of what English coaches were used to doing, all the ball mastery, individual possession and that sort of thing. They had a saying which was FITFO, you know, fit in or F off, basically, to the coaches. You know, you've got to adapt, you know, it's adapt or die based in that reality. This is the way it is, and it's like non-negotiables, isn't it? This is the way, and Chris even said as well, I've been, you know, chatting to Chris when he's in QPR, it's the same thing. You know, you still have people who are resistant to change and difference because they're not used to it, but it's about, you know, you either do it or you don't do it, you know, and everyone's got to be on the same page, isn't it? And essentially what you said about language there as well, I remember that, you know, we always, you know, when I was coaching Spurs, 9s and 11s or 8s, whatever, always talked about balance. You know, it's a big word for us because we didn't really work on defending enough. We just said balance in terms of, right, head up, have we got balance on the pitch? It means height, width and depth and stuff. In terms of in possession, out possession, you know, are we, you know, we're not overloaded at the back, you know, we've got players at the back. And I took that word to Chelsea with me, and Chelsea obviously had different language, and I was using some of the Spurs language. You know, like, oh, that's interesting. You know, they took on balance, and, you know, and I learned lots from them, and it's interesting because you come from one culture where you do have all these norms, you know, and the language norms, and you go to another one where things are slightly different, and it does take time to adapt. But it's just, like I say, it's really interesting, isn't it? Having that, trying to create, like any club, you need to create that culture where, you know, everyone.
Definitely, that's a big word there. So when you're talking about communication, because I read a fantastic book once by a lady called Erin Meyer, and it's called The Culture Map. And so I was blown away, to be honest. It's one that I'm probably going to go back to and read again, because it is a more of a business end book. But again, if you're trying to get a team of people to be the best functioning business, you know, the leaders and whoever the people are that are trying to drive it, there'll be a consistency in language. So if you go to Google, they'll be talking certain things and there'll be certain expectations. If you go to Samsung or you go to Tottenham Hotspur Football Club or Chelsea Football Club, hopefully if they're doing things right, or even if I'm honest, you go to a grassroots club, some of the best grassroots clubs I've seen, sort of producing some amazing players in terms of not just for professional football, but go on to play a great level of semi-pro or just have incredibly well-behaved and functioning football teams across their whole. There is a culture created. There is a culture, there is an identity, there is a consistency with the way that coaches are interacting with the children. You know, one thing I could say about some of the best grassroots clubs, there's a balance of being friendly and welcoming, you know, that public service thing, you know, open your doors and make sure people have a great experience and be friendly and welcoming. But then, like you say, there's, especially when you've got strong leaders, there's a consistency with, now, hang on a minute, that's not what we do. This is how we let children speak to each other. This is how we speak to our children. Can we kind of be consistent with that as well? So the whole culture thing is fascinating as well. And sometimes when you speak to children from different cultures, so when we talk, especially to children, the biggest thing that goes hand in hand with our own communication sort is observation. I think that would be on the same level. So when we say something to a child, we've got to be really observant. We've got to watch and listen for, one, their emotional reaction, and two, their response. Because if you say one thing to a child from a certain culture, who might have a really strict, domineering parent that might look like me in terms of being a big guy, a big presence, that child might respond in a different way to a child that's, I don't know, maybe more liberal parents that allow them to express themselves, even if they say something a little bit controversial or go against what the coach is saying in a respectful way. So the whole culture thing's massive there. So I think it's probably a good part to talk about in this a little bit more.
Yeah, I noticed that definitely here in Thailand and some of the other cultures I've worked at in Asia, whereas necessarily you have to, whereas maybe as you get to know a group before you can get into them a little bit more, if that makes sense. You're not being horrible, but say, come on, lads, come on, you need more here. Do you know what I mean? That sort of thing, come on, it's not good enough. That's some things, and you've got to be a bit careful here because maybe, culturally it doesn't go down as well or as easy as it would do back home. But yeah, I think it's the same thing, isn't it? It's about culture is so important, and having it's just things like having standards, isn't it? Something for me as well. So like I say, my sessions is work hard, we have fun, but you got if you're not bringing it, if you're not bringing the necessary quality or necessary intensity, or you're not serious, you're not focused, then I'm going to tell you. Do you know what I mean? I'm not going to mess about. I'll say, look, mate, you can go sit over there, or if you're not doing it, this is the level. Do you know what I mean? You're wasting my time, wasting your time. And I think that's really important as well, particularly with, you're moving up the older age group and any age group in an academy environment. If anyone's not on it or anyone's not focused or they're not in that zone, they got to be able to tell you, this is you're not, this is not the level to doing it. This isn't good enough. And I've always been, it's not about just being strict. I think it's just been about having boundaries, having standards. Do you know what I mean? And telling players, so, if you're not engaged, well, look, and also, look, it's different. If you were doing a session and, you got to look inward as well and be, reflective. Maybe my session there was letting the players not be engaged and I wasn't focused and, I was giving them the opportunity. That's why we always talk about, the ball rolling time and structuring the session. So everyone no one's got the opportunity to be bored. But if someone's, for example, messing about, or talking, you got to, for me, just got to, get into them and say, look, this is the level. Do you know what I mean? That's my, that's unacceptable. And you either fit for, innit? You're gonna play this way or go, innit?
Yeah, and so in terms of I would say so myself, but I can only speak for myself and I don't want to generalize other people, but I would say in the first 5 to 10 years of coaching, I think I used to say things a lot in training and the players wouldn't understand or the message might not have got across. And as an inexperienced coach, my natural emotional reaction myself was to be frustrated with the players. But, now that I've been coaching a long, long time and, that book, for example, with Erin Meyer, she speaks a lot about explicit communication and implicit. So, and again, in different cultures, so if you go to Holland, people are very explicit, straight talking. This is what I believe. I'm going to say it to you with conviction and clarity and confidence. And then sometimes, she speaks a bit about sometimes when she had to adapt to seeing the Japanese business model, for example. Now, sometimes they would just say something and you're expected to pick it up. I'm implying something here and it's your job to pick the message up. Now, if you don't understand things in that culture, I think it's quite refreshing when I've ever coached a young Dutch person or a young Portuguese kid, because again, I don't want to generalize and please don't think I'm not stereotyping, but there are some general things that come out. So a lot of young Portuguese children I've spoken to, they speak in football in terms with real conviction. And sometimes, it takes you back at first coming from an English culture of, we talk at the players a lot generally in England, I believe. And I like these strong opinions that come from these young Dutch and young Portuguese players. And they're quite challenging of your opinion sometimes. And I think knowing when you've got to be explicit, like you said there, Saul, when it becomes to behavior, there is no gray areas with a lot of this stuff. And you've got to, in no uncertain terms, tell children or young people, no, that's not acceptable. This is the line. That stuff there is intolerable. And one thing I would say with that about communication is we got to be careful. I'm talking in terms of behavior is my advice to coaches would be when you're challenging behavior and you're trying to correct stuff, try and detach the child from the behavior, because some of the big things I picked up personally, Saul, you spoke about being a teacher earlier. And I think most of my learning when it came to communication, and still is now, by the way, was when I was early on coaching, and I was lucky enough, really privileged enough to work in a lot of nursery schools with 3 and 4 year olds. And at first I thought, wow, I'm out of my depth. Like, how do you teach young children the basics of working with a football? But the more I watched nursery nurse teachers and experts with 3, 4, 5, and 6-year-olds, the biggest thing I learned from them is the way they speak to children. It's like that program, Super Nanny, Joe Frost. She's an expert communicator with children. And I wasn't picking up coaching or football from them, but the way they were speaking to children, they was explicit at the correct time. Like in no uncertain terms, they was quite cutting with the way they told children that's not acceptable. And then at times there was sometimes they had to imply things, or they had to ask questions saying, is that acceptable behavior? Do you know what I mean? To see their understanding. But learning from teachers and other people outside of the football industry, I think is one of the best things we can do as football coaches, in terms of communicating with children and getting our messages across, because I think there's a lot that we've got to learn. And I know I've learned a hell of a lot the last 10 years as well. So,
yeah, I mean, there's a great term I learned when I did my teacher training. It was consistency over severity. Do you know what I mean? In terms of when you're dealing with behaviour, that sort of thing. So it's not just, I was talking a minute ago about being strict and having standards. I'm not talking about, bollocking players or, shouting and being loud. I'm saying, well, look, listen, it's not, look, this is like, this is what we're doing. Do you want to do it or do you not want to do it? I'm not shouting on that sort of thing. It's about having the standards, and it's about how you communicate that again. So you don't have to be the one, not talking about, don't have to give someone the hairdryer treatment for them to know that you're not, they've dropped their standards, have dropped below the, where they should be. I think that's really important. But also then, said talk about young players as well. I mean, I remember, working under Tim Bradbury in America when I first, earned my coaching stripes there for a couple of years, working with 5 and 6-year-olds and thinking about my communication with those 5, 6, 7-year-olds, and then having to be, doing like adventure soccer, as they call it, which is great, telling stories around the soccer. That was like how you communicated it. That's how you got the players engaged and got them dribbling. We were dribbling and running away from the giant, we're scary, blah, we're going into the castle to get the treasure, blah, 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 using those sorts of things to do it, but also having boundaries, saying, well, hang on, stay on the pitch, don't run away, those sorts of things, like you say, knowing when to be explicit to control the health and safety, basically. So that's really interesting as well, isn't it? And you talked about, for example, then you mentioned it briefly about questions. What about in your session? There's about what's communicating in your sessions. I mean, always the old cliche, I suppose, isn't it, about coaching styles, or your coach command style, or your coach your guidance discovery. How to use your questioning. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So what we spoke about right at the beginning there, Saul, about on our coaching courses, again, we learned a bit about leadership in terms of laissez-faire, command, and all the other styles and stuff, and then transformational leadership, transactional leadership. There's so many, and there seems to be new ones being unearthed as well. But if leadership really is just trying to get the best out of a group of people and yourself first and foremost, right? So for me, the best leaders get the best from people. And when you look at them in terms of, this is why I said it's in the top 3. So when you look at, I know we go to the top end all the time, but an Alex Ferguson, sounds like he knew what to say, when to say it, how to say it. And, I'm all for the hairdryer treatment, by the way, so because I think even with our own children, you'll know, children push your buttons, and, there's 3 ways we interact. You've got your head brain, logically. Sometimes you can rationally, as a parent and as a coach, say to a young child, now stop, we can be rational, but sometimes there's emotion involved, and we respond with our heart, we go with our emotional intelligence, and sometimes that lets us down. And that's something we have to understand as coaches. And I'll be honest, I've raised my voice at my daughter before and probably spoken inappropriately at times. And I've gone back and had to apologize. And I've definitely done that as a coach. I've definitely probably said something out of terms, and I've gone home and consciously said to myself, no, Glenn, do you know what? You was a bit too harsh on that young kid. But you know what? I've either contacted the parent or gone back the next day and I've tried to repair it and said, look, how did you take that message? And I think that's important as well, with being mindful of, when you left a message, when you said something to a child to correct technique or correct the game, or you wanted to be a bit more demanding, because we have to push our players. So children like you being demanding, I believe, especially when it comes to the consistency of behavior. Children want to know where the lines are. But sometimes, we do emotionally, your head and your heart is always involved, especially when you're so passionate about developing children and your own children at home as well. Sometimes we get it wrong. But again, I think it's about being mindful to know when to. So in terms of style, Saul, there's the whole command. When do you ask questions and when do you give explicit instructions? I think that's a key one in coaching. And so out there, Saul, where you are in touch, does your coaching change because they don't speak English as much, you know, in terms of giving clear instructions, and sometimes you might be able to ask more questions over here. So is your coaching out there affected by that as well, in terms of asking questions and giving instructions?
Yeah, 100%, because you just can't communicate that effectively. And also you ask a question, and, you know, you get one of the boys to translate, and no one like is interested in answering it. Like whether they don't understand that, they don't want to put their hand up and say, yeah, I'll have a go at that question. Do you know what I mean? So it's a real, you know, struggle to coach them out of them, to coach their communication out of them, even though you're saying, okay, give me an answer. So anybody, or, you know, anyone want to lead this, who's going to demo for me? So yeah, definitely, you know, it's definitely in you know,
questioning is important, isn't it, in terms of the way we frame our questions?
Yeah,
sometimes
massively.
I think it's a skill, isn't
it?
it?
And also, like you say, you know, and we all know, you know, people say, what sort of coaching styles? You're going to use every coaching style, aren't you? You're going to sometimes it needs to be command, sometimes be guided discovery. You know, sometimes we're going to be questions. Sometimes you don't need questions. Sometimes you need to be a bit more direct, like say explicit, and lead the players. One thing is the real, like, you know, I think as well, just again to talk about the basic part of communication is the voice. And like in my coach, particularly if I'm working individually with players, people go on to quit, why are you shouting? Why are you shouting at skills? And why talking all the time? Because I think the voice is a real powerful tool, particularly when you work in an environment where it's just you and one player, and there's not that, you know, as a almost part of some contextual interference. So putting the player on a bit of pressure with my voice, you know, getting into them a little bit, come on, challenging them, talking to them a little bit, you know, saying the skills, putting them, because it actually does add intensity to the session. It adds a little bit of pressure on the player to, you know, getting into them always, you're talking to them to get him to do that, which I wouldn't necessarily do in a team session. I'd probably talk, you know, not as much, but I'm still trying to get into them. But I think that just the general use of the word, of your voice, is such a powerful tool to you know, increase the tempo, increase energy, increase intensity. And it's just about obviously knowing when and when to do it, and obviously not just talking and, you know, just talking, you know, verbal diarrhea, like being like, you know, a music in the background. But I think that's real, you know. And then people, you know, other coaches have done it, have criticized me on me, so saying, you know, why are you always talking with players? Because I think it is a real positive. It can have a real positive impact in when you deliver. And even to people saying that in my sessions, you know, it's about, you know, it's a bit tricky out here. One, because of that, the language barrier, also two, because of the heat, because I always want such a high intensity to my sessions. But again, if I'm working in group sessions, I'm talking to the players, I'm getting put them onto a little bit, you know, knowing when to do it and when not to do it. And, you know, a little word in the ear, or come on, can you do better? Oh, come on. It's such a, I think that's a massively underappreciated area of the general communication in terms of how impactful a voice can do. And look, there's definitely a balance. You know, when I'm in a game, if it's a game environment, you know, it's always go back to what the Chelsea policy is. I loved it, you know, never talk to an attacker in possession, never talk to a defender out of possession, you know. So, and also less is more. Also, you know, in a game situation, I'm hardly ever talking. Okay, a little bit here.
Words,
okay, balance, little, very much, because they concentrate on the game. But the training environment's different. Do you know what I mean? Particularly for an individual. And then, you know, it's just about, you know, it's about, like I say, and as you become more experienced, you understand when and where to communicate, when to be quiet. You know, that's the other thing, isn't it? Being quiet can be a real powerful communication as well.
Absolutely. So if we take communication is a two-way thing, and ultimately it's about connecting. It's like a good phone call. And I've been in one of them terrible phone calls where it cuts off at one and then it cuts off the other. It's about connecting. Do you know what I mean? And if we accept it's about connecting, first of all, it's about connecting our message. So what's the concept? What are we trying to get across here? Is it a behavioral thing, or is it a game of football thing? You know, tactical or technical? What's the content? What's the exact content? Do we understand it enough? Because if we're trying to teach a young person how to kick a ball properly, well, if we don't understand the technical concepts and components enough, we're not going to be able to explain it short and sharp and concise and well. And then what's the context? So if we're trying to challenge behavior, what's the context? As the young child lost his behavior in the emotion of a game, because if they have, be a bit forgiving. Understand, as long as they haven't affected anyone's safety, respect, or learning and thrown any punches, and they've gone in their own little world of a temper tantrum, sometimes, you know, we have to let children express that. Because this is one thing I got with expression and communication toys. I think this is a cultural thing in football as well. Children are allowed to express themselves until they display bad behavior. Now, or what's perceived as bad behavior, or a tantrum and emotional. Children have to get emotions out sometimes. And I'm not going to go like extreme liberal, let kids throw toys around and, oh, it's okay, he's expressing himself. I'm not saying that. But you know, part of a child's communication is letting you know that they're upset. So we had a young man in goal the other day in this little 7-a-side tournament. I said, so he, you know, he's a new young lad. He's only 15, 16. He's been in and around the elite academy environment. So he's ultra competitive. He's a very good young goalkeeper. Bit of a loose cannon as a goalkeeper in terms of personality as well, like some of them are. You've only got to look at the top end at Jordan Pickford. And, you know, sometimes they are so highly strung and whatever, they're going to lose their emotions from time to time. But again, the way we receive that and then how we connect with that young person is such an important thing. And what you said there, Saul, about talking as well. Look, I believe, and I've had to learn this, the first 10 years, I think I was getting it massively wrong. I probably still do quite a bit, but we've got 2 eyes, 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, because I think 80% of the time we should be watching, we should be listening. Even when they think we're not listening, when you turn your back to a game of football, we should be eavesdropping sometimes on what the players are saying, how they're saying it to each other. And then, you know, we've got to process all that and then choose our words sensibly and correctly. And like I say, keep it on task. Is it to do with concepts? Is it to do with the content of what we've been working on? And just be thoughtful with our words. Because like I say, I've been in times in the past where I've had emotional reactions from players, and then I'm a bit emotional myself. I've gone head to head with players. I'll be honest, I've had a lad in a college program for 2 years before where I was going head to head like 2 rams butting, because he's having an emotional reaction. I'm having an emotional reaction and no one's getting anywhere. There is no connecting. The message that I want them to pick up, they're not learning. And it weren't until that young person was about 22 years old. And we bumped into each other once in a car park over at Matchday Sports Centre in Wadham Lodge, that young person said to me, Glenn, we was always in a confrontation, weren't we? And I said, yeah, you're right. And I said to him, I don't want to say his name, but I said to him, and he was close to signing at Spurs at 14, 15. He ended up coming out of college program. I said to him, I wasted a lot of your time, didn't I? And he said, no, do you know what, Glenn? I learned a lot about myself. I've learned to not be as confrontational. And I said, I have as well. We kind of shook hands and said thanks or whatever. Do you know what I mean? But sometimes you're even making them mistakes because you go emotionally with stuff. Do you know what I mean? And again, what I learned from that is whatever message I was trying to get across as a coach for 2 years, whether there was a conflict of personalities or just there was a massive miscommunication when we're talking about miscommunication because the message didn't get across. But I'm mindful of stuff myself. I look back at situations that, you know, my communication did let me down, no doubt about it. And I just try and learn from them previous experiences to hopefully when I come across the next really big personality kind of challenging player, I hopefully will respond in a better way next time. So I think it's just important that we learn from our own experiences as well in the past.
Well, it was a bit like how we talked about the last show, wasn't it? About, you know, the maverick, you know, dealing with the maverick, you know, those personalities, like you say, you know, confrontation, those players, just like, how are you going to do that? You know, do I, you know, like I say, am I going to go head to head with this person, or is it my saving face? Is it my ego? Do you know, I got to be, you know, I got to be the, you know, the leader here, or I can't afford to show any weakness or that sort of thing. That's where they can be really challenging. Like I said, you know, go back to, you know, Alicia at Chelsea, I failed. I didn't know how to do it. I just, you know, and everyone else did this. Like, really difficult. So try one, and, you know, so like I say, you got to learn from your experience, and that's a challenge, I suppose, isn't it? Because, you know, you're communicating and understanding, you know, each individual, and sometimes you just can't communicate effectively. Some players you can't communicate effectively. You know, they're not open to whatever communication you're giving. So you can try your heart out, but sometimes, you know, it's just not going to happen. You mentioned, you talk about emotion. I think that's really interesting as well, emotional communication, and when you get too tied up in it. And I always go back to, you know, the game situation and how we sort of deal with that. And I remember, you know, really early in my career, you know, being, you know, in a Sunday League club, being in a cup final and giving like a pre-game talk, and I just got too emotional. I was like, come on, lads, giving it that one, and just like, and I looked next to, I was like, what have I just completely lost in the moment there. You know, I want to be calm and composed, and I'm just, you know, ranting, was, you know, just being like just too emotional. Come on, get out of there, get stuck in. It's got this, what a great opportunity, blah blah. And actually, they needed a bit of composure and rationality, and just to be a bit more effective. And I always think about that, and then, you know, going back as well to my early academy days, you know, Tottenham v Arsenal, those big, like, you know, big derby days in academy football, which was so much fun, but also very easy to get lost in the emotion there. You know, in terms of, you know, both clubs hate each other. You know, in terms of like the rivalry and even at that younger stage, which is in the academy, there's such an intense, you know, dislike really. You know, I remember going
I think
to,
a lot of that
you know,
comes from parents as well, though, doesn't it?
yeah,
In
yeah,
terms of
well, and
understanding that it's not.
no,
So, for example,
clubs as well, mate. No, I
yeah,
think that first one, you know, under those guys, you know, there was such, even within the staff, you know, there was real, you know, general wasn't very much, you know, much consensus on any points. I think now it's much more different now, because I think now you got a little bit more, you know, in terms of, you know, the management. So got just general coaches there, a little bit more open, and I don't think you have that general necessity. But I'm saying that it's still rivalries, you know. Anyway, I'm going to try and get around the houses to what my point is. But then I remember, like, then when I moved on, when I became more experienced, particularly when I was at Chelsea, and then that derby was the Chelsea, the Arsenal. That was the big one for because they were the two biggest academies in London. I remember trying to really communicate to the players to take the emotion out of the tie, like you said, and say, look, the parents are going to be up for it. You want to win the game, that's fine. It's a real challenge. You know, we want to be the best, have the best players, be the best team, but it's just another game. Do you know what I mean? It's just another game, and trying to take the emotion out of it. And then, like I said, being as a coach on the sideline, you know, not being a one ranting and jiving and come on, trying to reflect to the players with my communication. And actually, yeah, come on, we want to work hard, but you don't want to ever lose your sort of composure, become irrational, because then, you know, you're not playing the way. You're not going to just start putting in a mixer because you're desperate to win, if that makes sense.
And again, that's the ultimate test, isn't it? So again, in the first 2 or 3 games at this 7-a-side tournament the other day, they was completely different to the last 2 or 3 games when people were trying to challenge for, we're in semi-finals and the final, and then emotions took control and coach behaviour started to change and players' behaviour starts to change. And it goes back to that thing again about how we communicate. So we interact with our head, our heart, and our gut. And the gut thing's important there, sort as well, that people don't talk about enough. So yes, sometimes we are really logical and we engage that part of our brain, and it's a very rational response. And we say the correct thing, and you feel proud of yourself, thinking, you know what, I dealt with that. You know, there's a hurricane going on, but I was in the eye of the storm, nice and calm, like almost go into, like, I call it matrix mode. You know, when you can slow everything down, like that temperament, like a Berbatov has got. And to be honest, like a Wenger had. Like, I know he lost it a few times. I know he lost it, and so he's an interesting one, Wenger. He would lose his rag and really lose it, wouldn't he? You know, the whole pushing with, was it Alan Pardew on the side? And he's been in confrontations, hasn't he? But then a lot of the time, Saul, he would go proper laissez-faire, wouldn't he? Sit up there, just biggest trouble he had in the game was doing his zip up on his jacket, and he'd let his players get on with it. And the feistiness would come out. I quite like when it's over emotional. I really do. So I love them ones, like you said there. We've all lost ourselves at times, believe me. Any coach that says they haven't, they're just lying if they've been coaching a long time. But that ultimate test of the best thing about Tottenham, Arsenal, and Chelsea academy age group sort, and I love them games, is one, all right, the parents overplay it and they call it a North London derby. And I'm like, well, they're not playing a North London derby unless they're playing for the first team. Yes, they're playing for Arsenal, Chelsea, and Tottenham under 10s and under 9s. But the best thing about it was the ferocity of the competition. Anyone that's not been in an academy environment there, if you could bottle up how ferociously competitive young children are, you don't need to stoke that up as coaches. Do you know what I mean? You don't. If you go to a London Cup final the weekend, the under 16s, you know, I think Ryan FC won the under 16s Cup, but I know if you go to a London Cup final with under 16s, you don't need to stoke that up. It's going to be ferociously competitive, and children want to win. And it's a great thing culturally in this country that we push people to want to win. But it's just how we manage it, isn't it? That's the ultimate thing. How do we manage it? And I think a lot of the stuff, when you lose your emotion, I think sometimes you've got to go to your gut. Do you know what I mean? If you go with your gut instinct, and a lot of that is based on previous experience, you can only get intuition and instinct from a library of thousands and thousands of games or hundreds of games, and making experiences and learning from it. And then you just go with your gut instinct. Sometimes so that gut instinct is, I need to shout. I need to raise my voice and project to myself a little bit more than normal. And sometimes it is, do you know what? I maybe need to chuck a little grenade in there and provoke a little question out of them and let them go and sort themselves out. But yeah, it's fascinating, that whole battle that goes on, and it's all between our heads, our heart, and our gut instinct of what to say and when to say. But I love watching them cup finals. I think that, like you've said before loads of times, the competitive cauldron element that affects our communication so much, and our behaviour, just our general behaviour.
But what about communication during, for example, half time, talking about match day? I sort of, towards, you know, quite a few years ago, I started to actually then think about, you know, sort of how I was relaying messages during the half time. So then what I tried to do then was actually flip it back into the players a bit more. So I do more like, right, how do you think it's going? What do you think? One player. Try and get some feedback from all the players in terms of what their thoughts were. And then what I try and do is thinking about again, how to effectively, get something across, and bearing in mind, the attention span of kids and stuff, just try and say, right, okay, one target for you, one thing for you, okay, one thing for you, one thing for you, one thing for you. Maybe so have like a team goal, and then say each player, okay, well done, Rex. And now think about that. Maybe one player banks, so one challenge each, almost. So you're not overburdening. I know, like, some people are big fans of, like, you have so many targets for players. You've got 3 or 4 targets. You've got 3 or 4 targets. You got hundreds of targets for each game, because you're on players. We'll be slimming it down a bit more, trim it down rather. One poor thing. Break after this, bang, think about that, or that sort of thing. What's your thoughts about half-time communication generally, and how do you approach it?
Yeah, it's interesting one. I think I heard this with a teaching thing somewhere. So it was a teacher or someone that been in teaching. That whole thing about questions: pose, pause, pounce, and bounce. I think I've got it right. So a question gets posed. Either you pose a question, and I like what you said there. So, and I like to do that as well. I like, especially with young ones. I always like to go. Let the players give their feedback first, because if the 2 or 3 things, I don't like to do more than 2 or 3 things, because when emotion's involved, what it's like. So it's like the whole team talk at the end of the game. 90% of them are pointless, and the players are so over emotional, winning or losing, they're not going to really absorb anything. So I think being short and sharp. But when you have posed a question, how do we think it's going? Or you catch someone. So if you put it out there like you just did, Saul, okay, players, what's your thoughts? If there's 2 or 3 things that absolutely we need to work on, we've got to work on getting a bit tighter with our marking, or just the basic quality of our passing. If one of your players throw that out there, pounce on it. So then it doesn't look like it's coming from you. Give them that empowerment. Pouncing, okay, yeah, Joey, that's a brilliant point. Our passing was really loose. And then just pause and bounce it around the group. Okay, what's everyone else's thoughts? And then you might get your goalkeeper saying, yeah, you know what, I was trying to improve my passing, but no one's available. I need you to move for me, guys. And then you almost need to just keep them flames of that conversation going. And then before you know it, they've done their own little 5-minute team talk. But I think it's really important at the end of that as a coach, you give real clear, concise things. Okay, brilliant. Remember, here's the focus. Can we get a little bit tighter with our 1v1 contact defending? Can we be a little bit tighter with our passing? Be a bit more accurate. And remember what Joey in goal just said. Come on, guys, when he's got the ball in his hands, you've got to move for him. You've got to be available. So can we work a little bit more at our movement? So I think even if you let the questions and the conversation go out to the group, I think it's really important as they step back out at halftime, they go with 2 or 3 really key learning points, or whatever you want to call them, focuses for the next half. But like you say, Saul, one thing I say definitely don't do, and I'm saying definitely, and I've 100% been guilty of it, don't overdo it. Don't drown them in information. Half time is not the time to drown them in information. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, interesting. And what about so, like, the other, big elephant in the room, parents, we've all experienced those parents in academy football.
We're both one of them as well.
Yeah. But you know what I mean, but that, the cliche overbearing parent, or the trouble on side. And what's your thoughts on basic communication with parents, and advice for coaches and advice for parents as well in terms of communicating with their children?
I think it's one of the most important things. So, and I can say that from a grassroots point of view, having been at a club, loads of different grassroots clubs, where when I see the best functioning in terms of having great, it almost feels like a family, doesn't it? When you go to a grassroots club, you want to be a part of it. It feels like a family. Everyone at every age group knows each other. They do like the 7-a-side tournaments with the whole barbecue and a big event at the end of the year. It becomes like a family, and it feels the same with academies as well. When you've got that kind of family feel, I think there's a massive positive going on with communication. I'll give, Spurs, for example, I can only speak for us who've been there. I've been there quite a while. The communication with parents, I thought in terms of general was top drawer, even in terms of opening the doors, let them come in and see, and then doing presentations at the beginning of the year. Okay, so here, guys, this is our philosophy. This is what we believe in. This is what we're trying to, this is how and what we're trying to educate your son on. This is the expectations in terms of behavior. I think with stuff like that, that's where you have to be these are the non-negotiables. And these are the stuff where, do you know what, we're going to go wrong. But then once you've set out the guidelines, the ongoing communication is the hard stuff. So knowing when to pull a parent in the car park, and because sometimes you've got to deal with things straight away. If you leave things to manifest, so if you've got a game of football on a Sunday and, it's been a really competitive game, whatever, build it up, London Cup semi-final, parents have lost themselves in the emotion as well, like we all do. Sometimes you've got to deal with that there and then. sometimes you've got to do it pitch side. So I had someone when I was doing under 9s team over at Wanstead Flats. I'm not kidding, under 11, sorry. His parent turned up on a Sunday with I'm not joking, like 11 o'clock with a can of Foster's in his hand and a joint in the other end, right? And that's the most extreme. And I'm like, oh, I've got to go and challenge. I was a young coach. I was only about 21 myself, 21. And I can't leave that. It's not something that I can leave. I really can't, because I'd be irresponsible with my duties to the young people. I've had to go over to him and have a little bit of an uncomfortable conversation. Hey, listen, I'm not saying you can't drink, and I'm not telling you, I'm not telling you don't smoke what you're smoking, but can't do it here. And that could have gone anywhere. Do you know what I mean? But fortunately, they respected me. And that is the most extreme. You ain't going to get that all the time. But it's a grassroots pitch at the end. It's a public park, people walking by. Do you know what I mean? You're going to have all sorts of stuff to deal with. But then you've had parents completely losing themselves where they're almost on the pitch. And again, if you don't confront this stuff, you've got to be diplomatic. You've got to be tactful. But if you don't confront that stuff there and then, you can have a much bigger conversation. There's been loads of stories out there, parents fighting on the sidelines. And I think the part that we play as the responsible one and the leaders of the group and how we interact and challenge that behavior can diffuse most problems before they even start. And I think it's the same every session, so in every game. If you feel like your parents have got out of hand and they've crossed the line that you've already put in the sand, or they've gone against your code of conduct, we've got to be brave enough to challenge it, and we've got to know how to challenge it. And in a very respectful way, because if you lose the parent, you lose the child. Do you know what I mean? They could just go, the parent is king at the end of the day. If they say, well, I'm not playing for your football club, I'm going. So it's that relationship with the parents is absolutely crucial to get that right. And how we're saying things and when we're saying it it's a big one, mate. And there's no right answer, is there?
So it's going back to the culture thing, isn't it? Creating a culture at the club, saying, okay, let's say what are the norms and values, what are the standards that we don't. I remember going to one club in particular, I won't mention it, when it was a real tight pitch, playing under 9 football, and the parents were literally 2 yards behind you, and they were literally on the pitch, come on, screaming, and it was big London derby, and it's just like, whoa, what intimidating environment that was, particularly for the players. I thought, actually, that's a good challenge for the players, because you've got to adapt to it. But thinking about that, shouting, come on, stick it, and coaching and that sort of thing. So I suppose, different clubs approach it a different way. And I'm being at all the clubs I've been at, where parents have been saying, look, you can't come anymore. In all due respect, you've got a very talented young player, but unfortunately your behaviour and touchline is not acceptable. You've got to, and being almost being banned from it, and you've got to be brave enough to say, no players bigger than the club. But also, what's your thoughts? That one, that always, in terms of if there's a parent listening, if you're a parent of a very young, talented footballer, a girl or a boy, that old one about, what's the most effective way to communicate with that player? Especially that one, in the car on the way back home, maybe they've not had the. We've all been there, heard that when players are getting absolutely battered by their parents, for, it didn't do well. And, I've actually, witnessed horrible behavior where actual physical violence is threatened, but, you better do this, you better do that, or, shocking. But I mean, that's, as you say, there's many different sorts of parents out there. What's your advice to any parent out there in terms of the most effective way to communicate with a child, particularly in that, after a, bad result or performance?
Well, a couple of bits of advice. I don't think there's a set way, but a couple of bits of advice would be 100% is, first of all, detach your ego. Remember that your child is not your child's performance on a football pitch in terms of football is not a reflection on who you are as a parent. Unless you're an elite level coach and you're coaching your child, then it's not a reflection, because if the child fails in the science class or maths class, you don't see parents getting overly involved and taking some kind of responsibility but in terms of behavior, I'd say this to parents: if your child fouls with their behavior and punches another child in the face on a football pitch, that is absolutely a reflection on you as parents. And I will say the same about me as a parent. If my daughter, develops bullying, or she becomes a bully, or she chooses violence over whatever the other choice is, if I'm not looking at myself as a parent, I don't think I'm parenting correctly. Do you know what I mean, Saul? So I would say, in terms of the football side of it, try and detach yourself and let your coaches coach. And obviously, if you are a football person, you coach. Again, that's just about the skill of the coach. But if it's just about parenting and not coaching, just be a parent. Just be as supportive as possible, and just try and understand that they're trying to learn something that's quite difficult. There's already enough pressure around them, and be as supporting and encouraging as possible. And sometimes, so just ask questions. Just ask questions in a way. Instead of giving loads of instructions, should have done this, should have done that. How was your game today? What the usual stuff we do. What went well? Okay, brilliant. Well done. Keep that going. What do you think you could do better? And if you just ask your son or child that question, you know, kids are quite bright at all levels. So, you know, if you go and have a chat with a young kid at grassroots that's passionate about football, they've got a strong opinion on football. If you have that's not just academy or grassroots. You know, I mean, kids just, if they love football, they'll have a strong opinion. Let them express themselves. And then if you want to give them advice, they've had a tough day, you know, some of the best advice would be, okay, we'll go again tomorrow. Let's move on. Let's try and move on as quick as we can. It's not the end of the world. And I think that's a huge part parents play. So when it dealing that car journey home, you know, the cliche car journey home or the car park, you know, how you respond as an adult is more important than your child's emotional childlike response. Because just one thing I want to say, so another book I read is about the psychology of people, right? And the dynamics. And you've got child, adult, and parent, right? And I'm not an expert in psychology, but I've read this little bit on it. And so you've got a response. It's an emotional, psychological response. You can have two children who have adult responses. So it's adult to adult interactions. And that is the best thing you'll ever see. You know, I think someone like Ollie Skip, for example, was always emotionally quite intelligent. And most of the times he would respond like an adult. If you look at some professional footballers, like, I don't know, but I can't think of any, I don't really want to say this, but
Suarez with his bite.
There you go, perfect, mate. So Suarez, for me, he's an adult, but in terms of his psychological and emotional responses, he's responding as a child. You know, biting someone on the shoulder is like watching a 4 or 5 year old child. That's what you would expect a 3 or 4 year old child that hasn't learned about behavior. So regardless of your age, you're always going to respond in a certain way. And this is the interesting thing when I learned about that dynamic is when you get, so that lad I said in the car park, Saul, that I met at Wadham Lodge 4 years later, we was having for 2 years, in my opinion, by what I understand of psychology, we was having a child to child response. Do you know what I mean? There was a conflicting situation that we couldn't resolve, and we're just going at it like children and butting heads like rams. If you get, sometimes you need a parent to child response. So if the child's poorly behaved, in no uncertain terms, as a coach, you have to play the role of the parent, correct the behavior, let them know what's next. This is what I expect from you. Please change your behavior. Okay, you understand, Johnny, didn't you? I'm not saying you're a clown, but I think you was just acting like a clown. Stop playing up. Please behave like this, blah, 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 blah. And then the magic thing is, Saul, is as adults, so when I challenged that parent about the Fosters on the side, luckily, I got an adult to adult response. Do you know what I mean? I thought I'd done the adult thing to go and challenge him. Fortunately, I took a deep breath because I remember the feeling at the time and how nervous I was. He had an adult response, and then you got success. So I think it's about understanding that dynamic. Do you know what I mean? And parent to child. Yes, you have to talk to them as if they're a child sometimes. Parent to parent or adult to adult. And if you get the whole dynamic of two children in terms of emotional behavior, that's when I think we've got problems. So I think we've got to be the adult about it as much as possible.
I think mindfulness comes into as well. Something I've been practicing a lot of mindfulness in the last few years, like meditation, but general mindfulness in terms of, you know, reflecting and being present, you know, and that's a real big important word. So when you do get into that situation, understanding, you know, hang on, how was my reaction? Like, you know, am I being a bit irrational? You know, obviously I've been like, you know, practicing a bit of Buddhism for several years as well. There's, you know, things about that, about understanding, like, you know, in terms of, you know, we're having a confrontation here, understanding, you know, what they're going through as well. What's their outlook? You know, why are they challenging me? What's going through their mind? I think that's really important as well. And just having that presence of mind, thinking, okay, yeah. I had a situation the other day, like a bit of a disagreement with someone. I was saying, why am I reacting like that? And I feel actually I'm tired. I haven't slept well. I'm a bit stressed out. I'm acting a little bit irrationally here. I've bitten. Why have I bitten there? You know, and I think that's really important as well. And that comes from being practices as well, and developing yourself as an individual. I think that's really important. You know, both going off a bit of topic there, but I think that's really, really powerful. And I think talked about parents. The last one, I think, with parents that old cliche. Then, you know, when people say, you know, if you were you know, for example, you know, if you were going into watching a violin lesson, you know, would you be shouting instructions on the side
Exactly,
to
yeah.
overrule the coach? That sort of saying. Remember, you know, coaches are the professionals. They're there for a reason. You know, they're the ones getting paid to do it. What would your last bit of advice be? You know, final takeaway for coaches or parents or that sort of thing in terms of the communication?
Yeah, a couple of things. I'll pose you a few questions, to be honest, because I think, again, so we was getting quite deep for that about mindfulness. And I'd say that whole mindfulness thing, that's about empathy, isn't it? And trying to just understand put yourself in the young person's shoes, whether it's your player or your son or daughter. Try and have as much empathy as possible, because not always sympathy. So if a kid has a tantrum, I don't think it helps to be sympathetic, but empathetic and understanding that actually it's hard being a child, especially in the modern world. Give them a break, especially the last 2 years. My God, we've all been locked up and stuff. So understand that it's going to go wrong sometimes, and it's our job to help them through it. But the takeaway messages and the questions would be, so if I'm honest, is how much are you consciously working on communication? The verbal, the non-verbal. So, you know, we never really got into the game stuff. It's all about communicating with the ball. And, you know, we never got into the nitty gritty of communication, non-verbal in a game. A lot of this stuff's been about behavior. So how much are you consciously playing a part in setting the tone for communication in your sessions? Are you talking to your players the way you want your players to talk to each other? How much are you actually looking at developing your communication? You know, I think I'm becoming a bit more of an attentive listener, because you can sometimes say you're listening, but you're not really hearing stuff. So how much are we working at our listening? How much are we working at our observations? What are we looking at? Because if we're not watching for the behavior, we're not going to be able to correct the behavior, or if we're not watching things correctly. And then the way we talk, you know, just be mindful, guys, as coaches, I would say, is every single word that you put out there, kids are listening to, and they're listening when they think you're not even listening. They're paying attention, and they're watching every grimace on your face. They're watching every change of tone in your voice, and kids are ultra sensitive to tone, like you said earlier, Saul. So just be mindful that they're always listening. So before you speak, sometimes take 2 or 3 seconds to get clarity in your mind before you put that message out there, if you can, because I know we've spoke a lot about emotion today. And the last thing I would say is, and I think it would be right up there with, you know, you've got the 7 C's of communication, and if you keep going with it, you can do 15 C's, but the biggest 2 I would say, Saul, and I would say takeaway, is consistency. You said it right at the top. Consistency. When you get a consistent footballing philosophy, or when you get a consistent code of conduct, or call it what you like, but this is the behavior expectations, you really got a good chance of succeeding. Consistency amongst the adults, consistency amongst the parents' behavior on the sideline, consistency with the way your players interact. And the last thing would be is clarity. If you're unsure if a parent received the message correctly, or if you're unsure if the child that you had to challenge his behavior in a session didn't understand, or took it the wrong way and was a bit sensitive, and now they don't like you, or I hate the coach, because we've all been there. My 14-year-old daughter the other day said, "Oh, I hate you." And about 2 hours later, I had to put my arm around her and said, "Do you still hate me, darling?" And she said, "No, Daddy, I just hated you in the moment," right? So we've all been there. Just go back to them and ask. The next session, make sure you go back to them and say, "Okay, how are you feeling about what we spoke about the other day?" So you can all get clarity, and you can move on from a difficult situation. So yeah, sorry, so long-winded answer, but consistency and clarity would be the 2 big ones for me in terms of being good with your communication.
Yeah, and for me, there's some great points there, mate. Again, so just for me, that there's also that great cliche of that saying is that, you know, if you're not happy with the end result, think about the way you've been delivering the message, something along those lines. So, for example, particularly with the youngest players, you know, if you're looking at your young players in the foundation phase and they're not playing the way you want to play, think about, hang on, you know, you might want to be battering them or getting into them, saying, well, maybe look inwards first. Like I said, being mindful, reflective, thinking, well, maybe, you know, the messages that I've been giving them aren't effective, or they obviously aren't effective, aren't they? And putting it back on yourself, take ownership of those young children trying their best. You know, maybe what I've been giving them hasn't been up to scratch. Maybe what I've been giving them hasn't been enough, you know, rather than, you know, putting the onus on them, saying you're letting me down, saying, well, actually, maybe I've let you down. Maybe I haven't, you know, maybe the way I'm communicating those messages haven't been effective. But listen, Glenn, as always, Thanks again. Funny, isn't it? These chats just go, don't they? They just have their own little, they're autonomous and they go off. It's been again.
And again, so one thing I would say, Saul, is again, you know, whether you get really erudite and expositive, you can dig into this stuff because communication. One thing we never spoke about, and again, I would encourage, so when you're experiencing it yourself firsthand in Thailand, and you know, I'm trying to learn Spanish still, languages, guys. If you want to get ahead in your career, please start developing other languages because culturally, us as English people, you know, we're probably not as open to it as others. And you know, upskill your languages, try and learn French, German, or whatever, because that is a huge thing, whether you're at Premier League level or grassroots level, you know, it helps us massively. So, yeah.
Lovely. Glenn, cheers, pal. Have a good one. I'll see you next week.
Cheers, mate.
Welcome to the Coaching Family Soccer Coaching Podcast, a podcast for soccer coaches from grassroots to the pro game. Soccer coaches who love the game, love coaching, and want to get better. Join our community on Twitter @CoachingFamily.